In AD 19, Emperor Tiberius ordered the expulsion of certain religious groups from Rome. The empire had a long-standing problem: exclusive worship. Rome could not tolerate one god. It could only tolerate many gods, but not a people who insisted that their god alone was supreme. In the Roman world, emperors were increasingly associated with divinity. Statues of Augustus and later emperors were placed in temples. Coins bore their image. To bear the emperor's image meant authority, legitimacy, and dominion. An image was not decorative, it represented power. In the ancient Near East, when a king placed his image in a territory, it signified, my rule extends here. Now move forward a few decades. In a small Lycos Valley city called Colossae, believers are being pressured, not necessarily by Roman soldiers, but by ideas: philosophical mysticism, Jewish ceremonial legalism, angelic mediators, and hierarchies of spiritual powers. Into that intellectual storm, Paul writes one of the most explosive Christ-centered declarations in history. He is the image of the invincible God. Not Caesar, not angels, not cosmic powers, but Christ. If Christ is the image, then every other authority is derivative, and that changes everything. Welcome back to Steady Insights. Have you ever heard someone saying that Christ is the image of God? Paul has always consolidated his belief in Christ, and he declares this through the proclamation that Jesus has brought peace to the entire universe. It doesn't end there. He actually creates the impression that Christ is not just a great teacher or a prophet, nor even a messenger of good news. He is actually the image of God, the firstborn, the head of the church, the beginning and the end. Well, as we delve deeper, we would actually want to perfectly understand what Paul is trying to say, because this is very thought-provoking. And many people in the world now struggle to really connect to the idea that Christ is God, the image of God. An image, in the biblical sense, is not a photograph. In fact, it's not a statue. According to Genesis 1 verse 27, humanity, that is Adam and Eve, were created in God's image. Actually, even in Genesis 5 verse 3, Seth was created in Adam's image, or was born, so to speak, in Adam's image. These are not copies of reality, nor even imitations. They are physical, psychological, and social similarities. It implies, an image implies shared nature, shared characteristics, and visible expression of reality. In fact, when you carefully look at some of the writings of Paul in the book of Hebrews, he goes on to say that the ceremonial law was a shadow, not the very image of things, implying that an image actually equates to reality. The question is, was Jesus similar to God or equal to him? Because it appears this is what Paul would later clarify. He is basically saying Christ makes the invisible God fully known. Well, does it align to a particular teaching which many people in Christendom, even the world at large, have come to understand as the dualness of Christ, or the dual nature? of Christ. Let's delve deeper. If Christ is merely similar to God, then worship of him would be idolatry. But if Christ is the image, the full visible reality of the invisible God, then to see Christ is to see God. That means Colossians is not arguing for likeness, it is arguing for equality. Well, this gets more interesting. Let's consider a popular quote. In Colossians 1 verse 17, that Paul says he is before all things and in him all things hold together. In other words, the firstborn. In the Bible, we've seen several references to the firstborn. Firstborn means first begotten. And this phrase has triggered centuries of debate. Some teach that Jesus was the first being created by God, while others also insinuate that probably he was the first angel. But biblically, as with the term image, the word firstborn has a broader biblical meaning. Biblically, firstborn often refers to rank, not chronology. Now hear me out. Isaac was firstborn over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, Joseph over Reuben. In fact, David was even called firstborn instead of Eliab, his elder brother. Or should I say his eldest brother. They were all firstborns, not because they were born first, but because they held preeminent position over their brothers. And Paul clarifies this immediately. According to Christ, or in reference to Christ, he says, "For by him all things were created." If all things were created by him, he cannot be part of the created category. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. This is staggering. And Isaiah 45 verse 18 attributes creation to Yahweh. Well, I hope you are joining the dots. If creation is being attributed to God, and Christ is the creator of all things, then of course, Christ is God. Well, we delve deeper to really understand what Paul is trying to teach. If Christ holds all things together, then the very breath of his critics depends on him. Let's see if we can verify this. The head of the church. In fact, in the whole book of Colossians, Christ becomes the center of Paul's teaching. And in this particular part, verse 18 of Colossians 1, Paul says he's the head of the body, the church. Let me take you through some languages of the word as we know it now. In some languages, such as the Catalan or English, the word head can be translated as chief, principal, because it is metaphorically meaning head. In other words, when you look at Hebrew, to appoint themselves one head should be translated as they will appoint one leader. In fact, the book of Hosea 1 verse 11 uses head as leader. But Paul is actually carefully projecting a painful but carefully selected truth. Painful in the sense that it doesn't go well with those who hate what he teaches. These are the implications. Paul says, if Christ is the head, then the church are the body. From this idea, it means we are all needed. Every member is necessary. Because wherever you have a head, you'd have branches or limbs in the case of a human body. Aside that, everyone has his or her own work, a very distinct role, and no one is to be despised. There is no one inferior. We cannot despise anyone, and in that case, there are no inferior believers. And finally, we care for one another. In fact, in the Roman society, hierarchy was rigid, rank defined worth. But Paul, in his letter to the Colossians, dismantles that logic inside the church. Christ alone is supreme. All believers derive dignity from union with him. Wow. Seriously, this is a punchline for especially churches with several nationalities. We are all one. What next? Paul is getting very interesting. He brings up another very important tenet of the duality of Christ, as many people will put it. Him being God and man at the same time. Well, man only when he came to die. His godship does not cease. Let's prove this. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. There is a particular Greek word in here. The word translated as beginning is arche, a Greek word that means beginning, origin, first cause, or principle, but it actually means or can be applied as a ruler, power, authority, or principality, depending largely on the context. So carefully, we can say that this word applies to Christ and can have these meanings. In essence, Jesus is the origin of creation, the origin of new creation, supreme authority, and the first cause. Listen to how Paul's assertion clarifies this. He sets the title, the firstborn from among the dead. What does Paul mean? Remember, Jesus was not the first person ever raised. Though he was not the first to be raised from the dead. Moses had been raised. Lazarus, in fact, had been raised by Christ. But he is the first in the resurrection that defeats death permanently. His resurrection is not resuscitation, no. It is an inauguration. The new creation begins with him. Interestingly, if he conquered death, then every rival power is temporary. Every empire fades. Every principality falls. But the resurrected Christ remains. Wow. It gets even deeper. Paul talks about Christ being the reconciler, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Basically, the question that begs an answer is, what did Christ do that resulted in him taking first place in everything? Well, Paul reaches what I call a cosmic scale. It is not partial divinity. According to Paul, Christ is worthy of all these titles in its fullness. In other words, Christ is fully God and fully human. We have seen his glory, full of grace and truth, as Paul was clarified by John in John chapter 1 verse 14. He is fully God and fully human. But more interestingly, through the cross, by dying on the cross and rising again, Christ fulfilled the necessary requirements to reconcile humanity with God. On earth, it was reconciliation of humanity. But what about the things in heaven? How did he reconcile himself to those that are in heaven? If you ask yourself this question, I did myself. The cross publicly exposes evil. So when Christ died, the universe wholly witnessed the justice of God, witnessed the cost of sin, and the universe witnessed the self-giving nature of divine love. The character of God is vindicated, and all the accusations of the adversary collapsed. The cross is not only redemptive, it does not only redeem, but it's revelatory. It reveals the godly and the loving character of Christ. Wow. Let me ask you, how wonderful is this nature of Christ? To be a creator and still be willing to save the creature. In Rome, the emperor's image signified rule. In Colossae, Paul declares the true image has come, not carved in marble, not stamped on coin, but crucified and risen. He is risen. The supremacy of Christ is not poetic, no, it is a reality. And the question is no longer who is Jesus, but who rules your allegiance? Let me ask you, who rules your allegiance?